Thank you. You will probably notice there will be some similarities in things I'm saying that Jenny has just said, but I'm talking from a library perspective rather than an archive perspective. So in this paper, I'm going to be discussing the Human Genetics Historical Library that is housed within Cardiff University's Special Collections Unit, SCOLAR. I'm going to give a history of the library and explain how it came into existence, whilst looking at the journey of collaboration we've undertaken. I'm going to then move on to the priorities of collecting and the practicalities of promotion and discoverability. The idea of a human genetics library originated with Professor Peter Harper, an internationally renowned clinician and academic in the field of medical genetics, specifically in connection with Huntington's disease and myotonic dystrophy. In 2002, he began to become increasingly aware of the need to document and collate information related to the historical foundations of human and medical genetics. It was becoming apparent that key 20th century specialists in the field were beginning to pass away, and the opportunities to interview these people and to hear firsthand about discoveries they had made were fading. Historically speaking, being able to gain information about people and events connected to important scientific studies and breakthroughs from direct primary sources is invaluable. It was a terrible shame that these opportunities were rapidly disappearing. At that year's annual European Society of Human Genetics Congress, held in Strasbourg, discussions were held and resulted in the founding of the Genetics and Medicine Historical Network the following year. This network has a newsletter and a website and links geneticists and historians with a common interest. Other activities of the network have included international workshops, identification of key record sets, and a programme of recorded interviews that were undertaken by Professor Harper, transcripts of which can be accessed via the website, whilst the recordings, transcripts, correspondence and background notes are deposited within SCOLAR. By 2004, the concept of a specific collection of historical human genetics books had been realised and was detailed in the March 2004 network newsletter. This note stated that there was a plan to have a virtual library and an actual library. The virtual library would catalogue and electronically link existing collections in different centres across Europe and should be especially valuable for the small number of rare and valuable books and for books in languages other than English. Whereas the actual library had already been initiated in Cardiff as part of the Wales Gene Knowledge Park activities and with the support of the School of Medicine Library Service. At that point, there were already 500 volumes in this actual library. 200 of these had come from the Oxford Clinical Genetics Department collection, which had been due to be dispersed, and dated back to the Medical Research Council Clinical and Population Genetics Research Unit in the 1960s under the leadership of Alan Stevenson. These were added to by two further major donations in 2004, one from Professor Malcolm Ferguson-Smith of Glasgow and Cambridge, and the other a bequest from the library of Professor Paul Polanyi in London. By 2004 then, this collection of books was regarded as a historical library. Library staff from the University of Wales College of Medicine, which merged in that year with Cardiff University, had created a list or written catalogue of the books, and they were temporarily housed at the university's Institute of Medical Genetics, basically in a cupboard in Professor Harper's office. So crucially, in 2005, it was recognised as one of Cardiff University's special research collections, and in 2006 we've moved to SCOLAR, the university's special collections unit, which is housed in the basement of the Arts and Social Studies Library. In 2007, a cataloguer was appointed with special responsibility for the Human Genetics Historical Library, alongside responsibilities for the healthcare and medical libraries of the university. That person was me. And we received funding from the Wellcome Trust for the cataloguing of these books. By this point, the library now numbered about 1,000 volumes, due to further donations, and the lists of all the books have been placed on the genmedhist.org website to enable people to see what the library housed. To give you some idea of the philosophy behind the collection, we can turn to the Genetics and Medicine Historical Network newsletter, which summarises the principal aims of the library in the September 2005 issue. 1. To achieve a definitive collection, as close to complete as possible, of published books relating to the development of human and medical genetics, both as a basic science and its medical applications. 2. To ensure that the collection is housed, curated and catalogued so that it forms a valuable UK and international resource available to both historical and scientific researchers working to analyse different aspects of the origins and development of the field. 3, to act as a focus for gifts and bequests from individuals and institutions whose early human genetics books might otherwise be in danger of dispersal or loss. And 4, to form part of the wider genetics and medicine historical initiative and to act as a foundation and stimulus for research into the development of human and medical genetics and its social, scientific and medical implications. As you can see from these aims, the library has quite a definitive ethos behind its formation and a strong driving force to become a unique, valuable and usable resource in the world of human genetics. It's also based on principles of collaboration between clinicians, historians and library staff. As mentioned above, the library is built upon donations. So do we prioritise our collecting? A simple answer would be yes and no. Yes, we prioritise by trying to keep the library thematically focused on human and medical genetics. And no, it is almost impossible to prioritise when you have no money to buy books. In an ideal world, we would have a book fund and would identify key items to add to the collection, to enhance it and to keep it up to date. But because we're reliant on donations, we have to seek out other opportunities to add to what we already hold. As noted, by 2005, there are about 1,000 volumes in the collection. In 2006, calls for donations were made in the British Society of Human Genetics Bulletin, and in 2008, an electronic bulletin was sent out to all UK medical libraries. There have been presentations at international scientific meetings, such as the American and European Societies of Human Genetics. And of course, there is the tireless work of Professor Harper, whose energy and passion for the subject have been a driving force behind the project as a whole. His knowledge of the subject and of the key workers in the field has meant that he's been able to identify potential donors, both for books and for recorded interviews with them. His knowledge has meant that pertinent collections have been made available to the library. In fact, without him, there wouldn't be a library, and it was him who facilitated the funding from the Wellcome Trust for the cataloguing. There are now about 3,000 catalogued volumes in the library, with another 500 waiting to be added. Although the library grew steadily for the first 5 or 6 years, this growth has now slowed down, although we do have small groups of donations trickling in still now and again. Our donations have ranged in size from a couple of books to about 1,000 volumes. 3 substantial collections have greatly enhanced the library, namely those of the late Professor John Edwards of Oxford, of the late Professor Polanyi of London, and the personal library of Professor Harper himself, although this currently remains located at his home. As the field of human genetics is a relatively modern one, thus the majority of books published on the topic come from the 20th century. And this is one of the key points that makes the library manageable, and theoretically it may be possible to eventually include the majority of books published on the topic. As you can see from the table, we have a peak of items published in the 1970s, but our collection also starts in the 1870s. Initially, there was a designated cut-off date for inclusion in the library, and this was 1980. This was working on the idea of considering books only to be historical if they were published before this date. I don't think they really talked to librarians or archivists to decide what the cut-off date, or that there should be one, was. But as you can see from the illustration, this no longer applies. The reasoning being that in time all books will become historical, and in the field of genetics there are such rapid advances that this quickly becomes true. Although the table gives a picture of what the library contains, I don't believe that it can also reflect the production of human genetics books in general, and suspect that from the 1980s onward, there have been a greater number of books written than is indicated by this diagram. Whether the growth rate is exponential, I don't know, but we should realise that several factors should be taken into account. Firstly, that we initially stated we would not include books published after 1980, and although I don't think we actually turned any books down, it may have affected what was offered to us, donation-wise. Secondly, we are accepting donations from people who are either retired or close to retirement, and therefore their collections may not be up to date. The date of the books offered may relate to the date their research or practice was at its peak. In an ideal world, we'd be adding new books to the library as they were published. As I said, we don't have the funding to do this. With the nature of the creation of the collection, it is not surprising that we have a number of duplicates in our possession, currently about 300. Dispersal of these items is a sensitive issue, since all of our books have been donated, but it is thought that we'll probably firstly offer them to other specialist libraries, such as the Wellcome Trust Library, before we think of trying to sell them to raise funds to buy other books. Even though we generally only keep one copy of each book, we make exceptions if there are distinguishing features such as significant marginalia, and also if the item came from one of the major collections of Edwards, Polanyi or Harper, as we are preserving their collections or personal libraries as a whole. However, when several people have donated the same item, all their names are noted on the catalogue record as donors, with the book carrying a bookplate stating who the donor of that actual copy was. So what do we include? With a variety of donations being offered to us, a few guidelines as to the remit of the library were necessary, and here we return to our priorities of collecting. In relation to topic, we collect books on human and medical genetics. As these areas of study were only specifically demarcated as such since World War II, and much of the early work informed studies on genetics in general, early broader works on genetics have been firmly included, although more recent specialist books on non-human genetics have generally not been included. Other related scientific fields have formed parts of the collections that have been donated to us, and we've had to be flexible in our policy here. We do have some really strange things like travel guides and histories of mushrooms and things that just happen to be in the collections of the workers we were getting the books from. As noted above, where these items form part of the entire collection of a prominent worker in the field, then the wide range of their collection is an important resource in assessing their overall contribution and thought processes. In relation to format, we accept books, theses, and reports of working groups and committees. These kind of more specialised or informal publications are especially valuable because they're often difficult to obtain, and as such probably remain vastly underrepresented in the collection. I think these are the floppy items that Jenny was talking about. We've also got a few DVDs. We do not include journals in general, although there have been a couple of exceptions, some relevant periodicals, and some individual specialist issues. Part of the reason not to include journals in the library is due to issues of space. Long runs of bound journals take up a lot of room, which is not available to us, and many such journals are now available online, although we are aware that the preservation of early journals of human genetics does remain an issue. We also do not include personal papers and individual records, which seem to be part of the archive of individual workers. However, there was another project originally supported by the Wellcome Trust that ran in conjunction with the Historical Library to identify, preserve and catalogue the remains of key workers in the field of genetics. This was initially run by the UK National Cataloguing Unit for the Archives of Contemporary Scientists in Bath, but having closed at the end of 2009, some of the project work was transferred to Cardiff University, and we had two archivists, Tim Powell and Simon Coleman, working on the archives at Cardiff until the end of their project. These archives are now housed at several institutions. Within the collection of books we've received, there are several key works and items of interest, plus representation from a wide range of respected, interesting or famous authors. To give some idea of what the library contains, I'll give a brief mention to some of the more interesting works in no particular order. Francis Galton, 1822 to 1911, was an eminent prolific Victorian scientist and the half-cousin of Charles Darwin. Most relevantly for the Historical Genetics Library, he was a pioneer in eugenics, coining not only the term itself, but also the phrase nature versus nurture. Within the library, we have copies of his Inquiries into Human Faculty and its Development, and Hereditary Genius, an inquiry into its laws and consequences. The Galton Laboratory was founded at University College London in 1904 as a research centre for human genetics, and the first Galton professor was Carl Pearson, who had been a doctoral student and protege of Francis Galton, with works by Pearson and also several publications from the Galton Laboratory. Of historical interest are the works by Trofim Lysenko that reside in the library. He was a director of Soviet biology under Stalin. He rejected the ideas of Mendelian genetics, instead favouring the hybridization theories of the Russian Maturin. Lysenko became the director of the Institute of Genetics, and any dissent from his ideas was outlawed, with many opposing leading scientists detained or eliminated. Eventually, as his crop experiments mainly failed, he faded from favour, and today it is acknowledged that many of his ideas were fraudulent. However, it was a dark time for the Russian scientific movement. Another Russian of importance was Nikolai Koltsov, although he was on the opposite side to Lysenko, and worked at the Moscow Medical Genetics Institute. This was the first of its kind in the world and demonstrated that the Russians were at the forefront of genetic research in the 1930s. Tragically, it was closed in 1936 by Stalin, with many of the staff being imprisoned and later shot. Koltsov's research, mainly done during the 1920s, was on molecular modules of macromolecules, including DNA and proteins, showing how they might function as the basis of heredity, and anticipates the work of Watson and Crick by nearly 30 years. A Paris-published book from 1939 brings together much of this research. And of course, we do have works by and about James Watson and Francis Crick, the acknowledged discoverers of the structure of DNA in 1953, which proves interesting parallels to the book by Koltsov. There is a purpose to this library, as with all libraries, but as a specialised collection, extra work needs doing to ensure that it is known about and that it can be used. It was created partly due to a gap in the market. There was no other definitive collection of materials on human genetics, and now there is one. We want people to be aware of it. Professor Harper, as ever, promotes the library in any way he can. This has included the publication of several papers on the library and the project, and poster presentations at conferences. It is primarily his world that we are dealing with. He has created the library out of this knowledge and is feeding back its existence as well. On the library side, we're doing what we can too, albeit on a somewhat smaller scale. In recent years, with the rise of social media, we've established the SCOLAR blog, and items from the Human Genetics Historical Library have featured on several posts, all of which are tweeted. Meanwhile, in 2010, SCOLAR ran an exhibition on the Genetics Library, displaying some of the key books we had acquired, along with posters and information. It highlighted that the library forms a definitive collection of historical monographs and other books related to human and medical genetics. Within the exhibition was the book by Nikolai Koltsov, as previously mentioned. There was also a copy of Volume 3 of the exceptionally rare collected papers from the Moscow Medical Genetics Institute, which was donated by Professor George Fraser. The inside cover of the book shows that it was a presentation copy from the editor, Solomon Levitt, who was the director of the institute, and includes his signature. Sadly, he was one of the individuals who was killed at this time. Details of the exhibition can still be discovered on the SCOLAR web pages. The Human Genetics Historical Library is a project that exemplifies aspects of collaboration between academics, clinicians, and library staff. The library would certainly not exist without the expertise and contacts of Professor Harper, but neither would it be suitably housed and properly catalogued and cared for without the efforts of Cardiff University library staff. As modern works, these items would not necessarily have been identified by library staff as relevant for a special collection, where most volumes are usually pre-1900. Neither are they directly related to current research interests, although we do have academics focusing on the history of medicine and the body in general. However, by working with a specialist, we are creating a collection that will have a long-term historical impact and which embraces the concept of preservation for the future. The focus on human and medical genetics as a library collection is believed to be unique, but could so easily have been missed, thus emphasising the need, where possible, for library staff to work closely with academics and specialists in identifying items and topics of future importance, and to grasp opportunities where they arrive. As a result of coming together, an ambitious project that started off in boxes in back rooms and cupboards has been fully realised in the university's Special Collections Department, and it is now available for researchers around the world, whether that research takes place today or 100 years in the future.